Now, I'm an historian. I think I've said that before at these conferences, so I have the bent of mind of a history major. And how many of you have ever taken a history course at any level at all? Okay? How many have ever been in a course where the prof actually finished the course? That is to say, got to the date that the course was supposed to end on? Yeah, that's what I thought. That's because we always start back a few centuries. You know, teaching colonial America, you really have to go back to the Protestant Reformation. And to explain that, you're back to the 13th century. And so if you get to 1700, about, three-quarters of a century before the Revolution, that's good enough. The next course can pick it up. I'm guilty of doing these preambles or introductions. And while the topic is the John Paul II Revolution, it is necessary, I think, to set the stage. And I want to go back to probably the most controversial document the Church has issued since the Reformation, and that is Humanae Vitae, the great encyclical of Pope Paul VI on human life. This was issued July 25th, 1968. And it is fair to say that there hasn't been a document since the Reformation which was treated with such contempt, even within the Church, as this one was. Why was this so rejected? It was a statement of the Vicar of Christ, the successor of Peter, as the Cardinal has so beautifully elucidated. The Church is Christ, continued through space and time. This is the love of God expressed through the mystical person of the Church. It is the truth of Christ, the same truth that he came 2,000 years ago and spoke to all of those people who saw him in the Holy Land. Why was this so rejected? Certainly it's because of the climate. The pill was developed in 62, 63, made available, and for 5 or 6 years the Church, in its pastoral applications of moral truth, struggled with this. And there were some priests and even theologians who, in the years between the development of the pill and the issuance of the encyclical, basically gave some guidance to lay people that it would be okay because the Church would change its teaching. And of course, you remember the climate. The climate was that of Vatican II. John the 23rd is said to have opened the doors of the Church, the Aggiornamento. In 62, the Council discussed the whole liturgical reform, and some of those were coming as early as 63 and 64. The climate was, everything is up for grabs, everything is changing, nothing will hold. And so there was this agitation on this whole area of the question of marital relations. People started to feel accustomed to, in family life, to planning their family using contraception. And there were arguments against the encyclical, or at least the teaching of the encyclical. Before it was issued, the argument was made that there was a vacancy in the law. It's a technical term in canon law and the magisterium of the Church. If there's an open question, something that the Church has not ruled on, then people, Catholics, are free to consult the most informed moral source. They are free to get their own opinion. There are some of these open questions today. But Paul VI repeatedly mentioned in his teaching and his homilies that there was no vacancy in the law between 63, let's say, and 68, that the teaching of Pope Pius XI and Costa Connubii still held. Nevertheless, this vacancy in the law argument did persuade some people. Then, of course, after the encyclical was issued, which shocked the world, there was the conscience argument. Conscience argument said, well, as Catholics, we have the freedom of the children of God, and therefore we can decide ourselves what we should do. We take the voice of the Church as one voice, maybe not the most important voice, and we internalize that along with all of the other situations that we're in and all of the other voices in society, and then we make a decision. Basically, this makes conscience the arbiter of moral truth. There was the infallibility argument. Well, it's not infallible anyway, so we don't have to follow it. And there was the parable magisterium, at least that's what I call it. That means that if you want to find out about moral truth and how to live your lives on a practical level, you have to go consult a moral theologian, because the moral theologians have spent their lives studying this. You don't want to consult a pope or a bishop because they're the managers of the church and they have more important things to do with personnel and finances and so on. And they haven't spent their lives studying this, so you need to consult a moral theologian. Now notice that any one of these arguments, these four arguments, the vacancy in the law, the conscience argument, the infallibility argument, the parallel magisterium argument, would apply to anything. This doesn't just apply to the teaching of Humanae Vitae. Let's say we take up the issue of stealing. Is this morally wrong? Well, my conscience as a 16-year-old high school teenager hungry after the high school session says that I really need this candy bar from this store so I can take it. See, this is absolutely essential for my life. Or I'll find a moral theologian somewhere who will tell me it's okay to take the candy bar. Or it's not infallible anyway, some would argue, so it's not binding teaching. And you can find a vacancy in the law. I mean, when was the last time you had a homily on stealing candy bars after high school? See, you destroy everything. Think of the priest at the pulpit. Every pulpit in every parish all around the world had the rock of Gibraltar behind it. Literally, the rock of Peter. And Peter stood on that with his scepter and his ring and his mitre, the Pope and Christ right behind him, and all the other popes there. This was this rock. And if the people didn't like what you were saying, they could throw the eggs at the rock and be done. But with these arguments, this rock is gone. See, the rock is gone because every single teaching of the church, at least in the moral area, would fall to one of these arguments. It's not just Humanae Vitae. That's why one of the tasks of John Paul II was to rebuild the entire foundation, to rebuild that rock of Gibraltar behind every pulpit. That was one of his tasks because everything was literally up for grabs because many people, maybe not most, many people, priests, theologians, bought one or more of these arguments. And they're all fallacious, they're all sophistries. Yes, we have to follow our conscience, but it has to be an informed conscience. Yes, infallible teaching is binding, but so is all the other teachings of the church on faith and morals by the ordinary magisterium. No, you don't consult a moral theologian who's in conflict with the teaching of the church, and vacancy in the law does not mean that the church has to say it every 10 minutes. If it's been said once, it has not been changed, and that holds. See? So that was one of the reasons why Humanae Vitae was rejected. But it's also because of that climate that existed outside of the church at the time. This was the year of the Vietnam War protesters. It was the coming of age of the baby boom generation. More people were between the ages of, say, 14 and 22 in those years than it had ever happened in the history of the world. And it was also the age, of course, of the sexual revolution. And the sexual revolution, in its root form, depended on some new ways of understanding the world. Now, some of you may have heard me say this before, but I think it's absolutely vital. The sexual revolution was basically subjective, inductive, and experiential. And the teachings of the church, whether it's moral or doctrine, have always been couched in an objective, deductive, and principled universe. Now let me explain these. Objective truth says this pitcher of water is actually here, regardless of whether any of you can perceive it. Let's say there's a blind man or woman in the audience, okay? And she or he has not perceived this because she or he has not interacted with it at all, has not bumped it, has not heard it, has not had a drink of water from it, or whatever. And let's say this person, this happens almost never, but let's say this person really irritates me, okay? So I come off on the podium and I pour the water over his or her head. Does the water get her wet? How many say it does? How many say it doesn't? See, you're all objective. Objective says this pitcher of water is here and it's going to get her wet. Subjective says, no, it doesn't exist for her because it's not part of her reality, because she doesn't perceive it. Now, that's the formula for insanity in the Middle Ages. Because reality depends upon what I perceive. Objective truth says the reason why it's not perceived is because of flaw, tragic flaw, in the body of the blind person. That the flaw does not change reality, it only changes his or her perception. But you see, the subjective point of view says, whatever I say is true is true. Now, you've all had arguments in the pro-life arena, and I'm sure you've all been frustrated. And one of the lines is that they use, well, that may be true for you, but not for me. You know, for example, adultery may be wrong for you, but it's not wrong for me. Or premarital sex may be wrong for you, but it's not wrong for me. That's subjective thinking. Nothing exists, nothing is real, nothing is true, unless I say it's true. So the sexual revolution was incredibly subjective, as opposed to the objective point of view of the moral truth of the gospel. We're also inductive. Take a poll. How many people in 1968 on the college campuses think premarital sex is okay? Well, it's over 50.1% for sure, so it must be right because the majority of the people say it's okay. We count heads. How does the New York Times decide whether something is true in this country? We count heads. And as Lincoln said, more or less, you can't fool all the people all the time, so whatever the majority says must be correct. That's opposed to deduction. God is good, God created the world is good. That's syllogistic thinking. Now, believe me, outside of this convention, if you preach that way in the United States, people come up to you and say, would you please talk English about it? Because they don't understand deductive reasoning. So the sexual revolution, and generally our society, is subjective and inductive as opposed to objective and deductive. And the third difference is that our society, and again, this is some of the roots of the sexual revolution, is experiential. If it feels good, do it, right? As opposed to principles. Principles would say the marital act is reserved by God in the creative act to spousal love between husband and wife. No, not for the sexual revolution advocates or generally for our society. So we are subjective, inductive, and experiential. The faith has always been couched in an objective, deductive, and principled reality. This is a huge problem. And the change goes back as far as the Renaissance, but it did not become terribly acute, especially in our own country, until, I would say, after World War II. Now, Humani Vitae, as Professor Janet Smith has taught us in eloquent terms, was based on the natural law. And the natural law, which is a beautiful construct put together by the Greek philosophers and enhanced by St. Thomas, the natural law is in a deductive, principled, and objective world. And it didn't sell well. It really was not terribly well understood. So those priests and deacons and people such as the family honor people here, when they tried to defend the teachings of Paul VI Humani Vitae, they were speaking in effect in a language and a worldview that their hearers did not understand. And so after a while, they kind of gave up. I don't know if you remember the Judge Thomas hearings in the U.S. Senate when he was being considered to be a Supreme Court justice. And he and Senator Biden from Delaware, Senator Biden is a Catholic, and Judge Thomas was educated, in part at least, at Georgetown. So he knew something of the Catholic tradition, and so did Biden. So they had this incredibly arcane discussion on the natural law. Now, I know a little bit about the natural law, but I'm not an expert. But I couldn't follow this. And of course, part of it was they were both trying to not say what they wanted to say. Biden wanted to get Thomas to say that he would overturn Roe v. Wade, and Thomas was desperately trying to say that not to say that that's what he wanted to do. So they had this incredibly arcane discussion, which I defy anybody except a PhD in the natural law itself to follow. But part of the reason why it was not really clear or it could be followed, besides their attempts to really obfuscate the point, is because we don't think in those terms. This is a language and a mode of thought that dates back to the Middle Ages, and even in some ways back to the Greeks, to the classical Greek era in Athens. And we just don't think in those terms. Now, probably all of you do here, but if you want to talk to anybody else, then how do you do it, see? Now, there's another difficulty that Humanae Vitae exasperated, if you will. Back at the time of the fathers of the church, there was a question that occurred in, I'm sure it was pastoral, about the marital act. And the question was asked, what should be included in terms of the physical act and in terms of intention by spouses when they engage in the marital embrace? And this question was the same question asked up until about 1900. What should be included? And of course, some said you had to absolutely include the intention of children each time. Others said, well, it was not so important, but you had to at least specifically and explicitly include the intention to show affection to each other. In any case, there was a distinction then made between explicit and implicit intention. And finally, you get all the way up to St. Alphonsus Liguori, and there's a beautiful synthesis that he puts together that both intentions can be implicit. What that means is you just have a general intention at the time of the vows that you are open to life and that you love each other in the way you should, and that you don't have to think about either one explicitly in the mystery of the marital union. But with the dawn of the 20th century, especially with the Lambeth Conference of 1930, the Lambeth Conference was a conference that the Anglicans have among most of the Anglican, I think it's the heads of the various Anglican churches in the various countries. In any case, they still meet now and then, but in the 1930 meeting, the Anglicans, their leadership body, made an exception in the question of contraception. They said that in certain circumstances it would not be immoral for Anglican married people to use contraception. Now this, as you probably all know, was the first break, the first time any Christian church had permitted without sin the use of contraception. So there came to be then a different question. The question now was, what can be excluded? Okay? Now, everybody knows if you ask a different question, you get a different answer. If I say to you, ladies, do you love your husbands? The answer is, I hope, yes. If I say to you, when did you stop beating them? You get a different answer, right? And the answer may not include everything that the first one did, because the first one says, I love you, and the second one says, I don't beat him. You know, it's a different answer, which includes different elements. So when you ask a different question, you get a different answer. And so the question was, basically, because of what the Lambeth Conference had posed, can life be excluded by intention and in the physical act through the intervention of chemicals or whatever? Pope Pius XI said, no. In Casti Connubii, issued in December of that year, no, children cannot be excluded. That then kind of destroyed the synthesis of St. Alphonsus. This is very important, because that synthesis was beautifully put together. But with the new question, the logic of the old synthesis was no longer there. Now, in the 38 years or so between Casti Connubii and Humanae Vitae, the church did not really issue any other formal document. There were some talks and homilies that Pius XII gave, particularly his address to midwives on the question, but there wasn't any formal written statement until Humanae Vitae. And in that 38 years or so, there was a great development in sociology, in psychology, in even in spiritual circles, of the importance of the relationship between the spouses. So Casti Connubii, somewhat wrongly interpreted actually, but the way it was normally interpreted was the church wants children. And all of this other development then was kind of ignored. Now Pope Paul VI is faced with a real conundrum. See, he wants to get back to the synthesis of Alphonsus Liguori, but he's got this new question. And he can either just reaffirm what Costa Canubi was interpreted as saying, it's only children, or he could say what he did. It's both. And he said, in the famous language, you cannot separate the procreative and the unitive. Now, you have two things, right? Procreative and unitive. Now, this morning, I had eggs and bacon. That is often a nice breakfast that we Americans eat, right? But couldn't I just have eggs? Or couldn't I just have bacon? I mean, do they have to go together? Well, according to the menu, they didn't have to. Okay, so can I just have one or the other? The answer is yes, I can. Now, why do they have to go together? Because that's what God said. Well, yeah, but we dam up rivers, we fly in planes, we hold meetings in darkened rooms without windows. We are in Florida and it's 95 degrees outside and we're very comfortable at 70 or whatever is in here. We insulate ourselves from what God created. So why can't we insulate ourselves from our bodies and the way they function? This was almost an insoluble question because the answer goes back to the natural law. But also that synthesis of the fossils still isn't back in place. And that had to be put back together again, or at least an equivalence. Now, this is the task of John Paul II. This is what he set for himself, I think. This was something that was in his mind, I think, from the time that he was a young auxiliary bishop, because he gave a talk in Krakow in 1958, which set the tone for most of his theological and philosophical work from then on, and he never really varied from it to the day he died. But I want to go back and review his life just a little bit, especially his early life, because it teaches us that these tenets that he embraced, both philosophically and theologically, and that ultimately answered this question of the natural law problem and the restoring the synthesis of Alphonsus Liguori, were based not just in thought, but actually in real life practical experiences. And I don't think any of us in the United States who lived here for the last 50, 60 years, which includes everybody in the room, could possibly understand in an experiential way, if you permit that phrase, what John Paul II went through in his younger life in Poland. He was, of course, born in 1920, and things were relatively peaceful except for the runaway inflation that was caused by the various economic agreements that were made after World War I, sorry. And then, of course, the Depression came in. But then, of course, with World War II, the Nazis invaded his country. And we've all seen the pictures, the movies, the accounts, where people would be just taken from their homes. The Nazis would walk into a house and take the young men. Sometimes they would take the older men. They certainly would take the Jews away. Many of John Paul's friends, because in the town he grew up in Pardubice, had a significant Jewish population, and some of these young men and women were classmates of John Paul II, and they were just snatched, never to be seen again. The beginning of the Nazi invasion, he and his father actually, because by that time his mother had died, so had a younger child, and his brother was also dead by this time. His father and he actually started to march away from Krakow towards the east, away from the Nazi invasion, but finally gave up and went back because of the crowded conditions on the roads. But that kind of fear and that kind of attack on human dignity, just taking people from their families, killing them, was such a traumatic experience for John Paul that I think he decided very early on, because he always was an intellectual, he decided very early on that the only way to defend against something like this was the repeated and absolute insistence on the inherent human dignity of every single human being, regardless of what they did, that everyone had certain rights. And of course, this is a very American kind of idea, because it's the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, it doesn't make any difference who wrote that. I mean, Thomas Jefferson did. And he didn't observe it very well. I mean, he held slaves, but it has nothing to do with the truth of the statement, you know. It's true regardless of why he wrote it or what he did later. So this John Paul came to in an experiential way because of what he saw on the streets of his native Krakow. And of course, then the Russians come in, and things don't get a lot better. During the Nazi period, of course, he was forced to work in the quarry. And he saw again the dignity of his fellow workers. This is the origin, in many ways, of his great encyclical on human work. He saw the dignity of his fellow workers who shielded him from the worst of it and allowed him time to do his studies because they recognized in him the brilliance of his mind and that he had a future outside of mining stones. And then, of course, you had his interest in drama. And there's been quite a bit written about this, but they had the rhapsodic theater. Because of the social conditions at the time, they couldn't put these on publicly, nor did they have access to the usual props. So it was done solely by words and the bodies of the actors. This was done without any kind of props, any kind of costumes, any kind of music, any kind of what we would by now call special effects, if you will. It was just 4 people, 5 people on the stage reading lines. Now this is a very personal, very individualistic interpretation of a particular role. See, the dignity of the human person is each and every one. The quarry was what was done to him and his fellow workers. The drama, again, is each and every one. I have an uncle who's a musician, and every now and then there's another director, and they take, let's say, the glory of the Haydn Mass a little differently. And people say, well, that wasn't like so-and-so does it. Well, there aren't 2 ways, 2 rhythms. You can take any piece of music at the same time. I mean, in any one time, there's only one way to do it. And the way you do it is the way the director who's directing it says you're going to do it. He's the one that decides. It's very personal, very individualistic. Drama is like that. Each actor interprets the lines in the way he or she thinks is the best possible way. That's the art of the actor. But it's very individualistic, and it's based on the individual experiences of each actor who brings those experiences to the stage and interprets what the author of the drama intends for the audience to see in the characterization of that particular persona. After he's ordained, John Paul is sent to Rome, to the Angelical. And I'm not sure whether it was his own choice or whether it was the cardinal who sent him there, but I believe it was his own choice. He decides to study Carmelite spirituality. Now, there was some background to this because while he was studying at the University of Krakow, he met a rather obscure figure, Taylor, who had some understanding of Carmelite spirituality. He had a group of young people who were studying the classic works of St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross. So when he gets to the Angelicum, he decides to study mystical theology, and he writes a dissertation on the idea of faith in the works of St. John of the Cross. Now, of all theological endeavors, of all topics in theology, the one that emphasizes the individual human person in his or her particular relationship with God is mystical theology. No other one does it. Everything else does broad principles and deduces from those broad principles certain truths, deductive, objective, and principle. But mystical theology, no, it studies how St. Teresa lived her relationship with God, or how the little flower did, or how St. John of the Cross did. It's very individualistic. It's very experiential. And it's the only branch of theology in the Catholic world that has those characteristics. See, his whole life, from the very beginning, is focusing on the individual and on their experiences. No wonder the dignity of the human person became one of the touchstones of his pontificate. He comes back from the Angelicum in Rome, and the Archbishop Cardinal Sapieha assigns him to a rural parish. I think that was just kind of an interlude, so he would have some priestly experiences in a normal parish life. That lasted about a year. And the cardinal says to him, "You're going to Krakow now, and I want you to study philosophy at the University of Krakow." And I'm sure John Paul, well, he probably thought it and didn't say it. Priests in those days didn't say that to cardinals. But he probably said something like, "Say what, Your Eminence? You know, I just did one. You know, I don't need another one." But he went. And the head of the department of the Krakow philosophy department was a guy named Roman Ingarden. Now, if you permit just a little bit of a diversion here, Ingarden was a phenomenologist, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. But the founder of phenomenology was a German philosopher named Edmund Husserl, who lived about the turn of the 20th century, around 1900. And if you think of Edmund Husserl as the grandfather, and then you think of the next generation, this is just academically, this is not family, this is just academic family, okay? So Husserl had three significant students in John Paul II's life. He had Roman Ingarden, he had Edith Stein, and he had Max Scheler, okay? So that's the first generation, two brothers and a sister. Okay, then Ingarden has, quote, a son, John Paul II. And John Paul II did his dissertation on his academic uncle, Max Scheler, and he was heavily influenced by Edith Stein, particularly in his whole discussion of divine mercy, but also because she was a Carmelite and had, of course, plugged into this Carmelite tradition that John Paul II was very much part of. Now, phenomenology, I'm sure at first, was quite foreign to John Paul II and probably was not something he really wanted to do. But as any of us who have ever tried to study anything, especially at the graduate level, you either do what your prof wants you to do or you don't get done, right? So I remember when I was doing my history degree, I really wanted to do a figure in Germany in my process. He was working in France. He says, "You really want to get done, or do you want to drag this out for another 5 years?" And he asked me at the exact right time. I was so tired of this stuff that I'd do anything to get done. And so I did France. And he was right. Get it done, then you can do what you want. So I think John Paul followed that advice. If he was going to get this degree, and the cardinal wanted him to get it, he was going to have to do phenomenology. But somewhere along the line, and pretty early, he found this to be an opening. Now, philosophy, since Descartes, had locked itself within the mind of the human person. Descartes, René Descartes, the famous French philosopher, had that famous line, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. That grounded existence in the interior thought of each of us. It's not God that created us. It's my thought, and that's how I exist, because I know, I think, therefore I know I am. Existence is grounded within us. Kant comes along, and I'm oversimplifying this, I know, but Kant comes along and says the only reason for doing anything good is a sense of duty that's internal. Internal, not because it's good objectively, but internal. And so through this tradition, finally you get to Nietzsche and so on, and all philosophy was locked in the internal functions of the internal senses. All they cared about, really, was what was going on within each of our minds. Now, the trouble with that is that doesn't leave an opening for God or anything outside of the human person. Husserl comes along and says, hey, there's nothing in here that isn't out there first. It sounds classic, it is. It's Aristotle. Nothing in the senses, nothing in the mind is not first in the senses. But he says, oh, that's right, you know. But he defines what's out there as things we experience. And the experience then is contained in our memories, what they call it consciousness, but it's our memories. And what Husserl wanted to do is what all philosophers want to do, and that is to get to the heart of the human person. And he says the way to the heart of the human person is what people think about these experiences, particularly the life-changing experiences like romantic love, seeing the ocean for the first time, seeing the earth from 23,000 miles like the astronauts have, or the earth from the moon. At any rate, you can build a model of human personhood by analyzing these experiences. Now, the reason this works in theology is because it's open to the real world. It starts with something outside of the human person. And John Paul II says, aha, we can use this because there's an opening to what's real outside of the individual. Now, remember all of this emphasis on the dignity of the human person and individual experiences. Remember, too, that our world is inductive, subjective, and experiential. So what does John Paul do in a speech in Krakow in 58, as I mentioned? He links phenomenology to the faith with the reference to the fact that we're created in God's image and likeness. Now, being an image of God is to be a person. To be a person is to have a mind and a will. Those are all synonymous terms. Why is this so revolutionary? And it is revolutionary. It's revolutionary because if we are created in God's image and likeness, then our individual experiences, counted one by one, inductively, and known the only way they can be known, subjectively, that is by us, individually. So it's inductive, subjective, and experiential, will reveal something of God, right? Okay, so you have an opening then to the modern world. You can, in effect, do theology on an experiential, inductive, and subjective way, using the lingo of modern society, right? But if we're an image of God, we don't know who we are or how we should act unless we know who God is and how God acts, which is the ultimate objective principle in the world from whom everything is deducted. With this link, he can move either from the top down or from the bottom up, and you have to move both ways at the same time. Okay? Now, how does this actually work? Well, most of you would answer a question, what are the commandments? You might say the law of God, but that's sort of harsh in our society. So then they try to calm it down a little bit. They say guidelines, which I never thought were too good. Or you might say it's the instructions for the creation of the human person, which is sort of like saying we're just machines and things, and this is the owner's manual. None of these things are too good. Okay. So if it's the law of God, okay, then let's say a teenager is saying to his dad, and I'll use my brother, he'd kill me if I was doing this, but he doesn't know. Let's say my brother says to my dad, and my dad, you have to understand, was Irish Catholic down to his little finger, and this was 1967, and my brother was like 14. Dad, I'm not going to go to church tomorrow, Saturday. I'm not going to go to church tomorrow. You always go to 7:30. I'm not going to get up that early. I'm going to be out tonight. You said I could go. Dad says, you're going to church? Paul says, no, I'm not. Dad says, yes, you are. Paul says, I'm a free person. It's a free country. I've got a mind and a will. I can do what I want. I'm a mature being. No, you're not. Not as long as you live in this house. You're going to church. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. And Dad says, well, don't let the door hit you in the rear. Of course, Paul went to church the next day. But all this does is set up an argument of authority. See, an authority figure is superior against an inferior. And eventually, when Paul gets to be 22, he can do what he wants, right? And Dad can't do anything about it. Now, obviously, one hopes that in this situation that the inculcation of the pattern will take hold eventually. How would John Paul II do this? Well, and I've never read anything where he actually said this, but if you will, I'm guessing. He would say, okay, you know, Paul, he would have my dad say, you know, Paul, you are a free person. It is a free country, thank God. You have all the rights and privileges of every other human person. You have a mind and a will, therefore you're a person, you're an image of God. Your mother and I were so pleased the day you were conceived and then 9 months later born. We were overjoyed because you were a gift to our family as another human person made in the image and likeness of God. Now act like it. Okay? See, to be made in God's image is to act like God, is to love as God loves, it's to do what God does in this self-giving way that the Cardinal elucidated so beautifully. You see, that calls on the person in his or her freedom to do what they are, what is consistent with who they are, see. And it's not offensive because it doesn't say you must do this. In our society, if you say to anybody, you are going to do this, the answer is, no, I'm not, or something a little stronger, right? So this whole way of operating allows us to emphasize some of the things that the culture is emphasizing without doing damage to the faith. Now, the union of phenomenology with the data points of revelation is absolutely brilliant. As I mentioned, I'm a historian. If you told me to teach any kind of history without using dates, names, or places, I'll tell you it's impossible. This guy was crowned an emperor once upon a time. It tells you an awful lot, right? I mean, Charlemagne was crowned emperor of the Holy Roman Empire by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day 800. I mean, I'm using place names, Rome, I'm using names, right? And I'm using dates. But if I can't use those, I can't do history because that's the method. Now, what John Paul II did is take a method in theology that he had been steeped in, just like all of us, and basically created another one. That's incredibly hard to do. The only other person in the history of the faith who's ever done this was St. Thomas, who used the philosophy of Aristotle. Now, Augustine created one, in a sense, not strictly speaking out of whole cloth, but nobody had, in a completely comprehensive way, created a union of philosophy and the faith before him. Justin Martyr did a little bit, and some others did some things. But Augustine was the first one that did it in a comprehensive way, and he used the philosophy of Plato. Because there was a paradigm shift in the way people thought in the 12th and 13th centuries, there was a necessity for another way. That was St. Thomas who used Aristotle. Another paradigm shift in the way we think, the way we look at the world and human persons has occurred in since the Renaissance, but most very acutely in the 20th century. And we needed a new way, and that's precisely what John Paul II has given us. Now, if I'm even half right, you realize how significant this is? How long did the synthesis of Augustine last? How many centuries did people learn the gospel using the Augustinian system? You probably don't know. I actually wrote out the dates and subtracted it. Augustine died in West Africa in 430. St. Thomas died in present-day Burgundy in 1274. You realize how long that is? That's 850 years. Can you imagine being on the top of the music charts with a song for 8 centuries? How about a computer chip? You invent a computer chip that Intel buys, and it stays as the technological chip for 2 centuries. Last time I bought a computer was out of date before I got it out of the store. You know? This is incredible. These men were absolute geniuses. Thomas's system lasted 750 years, 7.5 centuries. And they didn't understand it, the day he died. It took them another 300 years, and there's still people debating about what he meant in certain passages. We're going to be mining John Paul II's writings and works for at least 4 or 5 centuries. Now, think of the faith as this huge diamond sitting in a museum in the middle of a room underneath the skylight. And it has all kinds of light because it's a beautiful sunny day. And it's a rainbow of colors. And it has 7 facets, 7 huge facets. God, creation, Christ, church, sacraments, grace, commandments. And then it's right in the middle of the room. And think of John Paul II standing there at 90 degrees, and St. Augustine standing there at 180, and St. Thomas at 270. And the professor of theology, St. Thomas, and the bishop, St. Augustine, allow the Pope to go first because he outranks him. So John Paul says, look at that passage, look at that beautiful teaching of the church about the creation of Adam and Eve, the creation passage. St. Thomas is if you just see, he's about to scream. He says, I would have flunked you, Holy Father, if you were in my class at the University of Paris in 1250, if you said it that way. You can't say it that way, you've got to say it this way. And Augustine's looking at them both and says, you're both wrong. You've got to say it that way. Three different points of view based on the three different philosophies saying, in effect, the same truth, just in a different language. Same truth, just in a different language. Now, actually, the example wins because you have to put Augustine as standing on the ground floor and St. Thomas standing on Augustine's shoulders, and then John Paul on top of Thomas, because they all rest on each other. Nevertheless, you get the idea. Now, the reason why we need John Paul II is not because Thomas is bad or Augustine is bad. It's because if you talk Thomistic language, nobody's going to get it except people who already understand it. Now, that's fine if all you want to do is talk to people who already understand it. But we don't, because at the heart of the church is evangelization. Now, that solves then this whole question of the inductive, subjective, and experiential point of view. And we don't deny the other. You just lead them. You lead them from their own point of view, experiential, inductive, and subjective. You lead them to accept the objective, deductive, and principled truths of the faith. It's not that we do any violence. It's just how you get there is the only question. How does it solve this whole other problem of the synthesis? Because once you say you are an image of God and called to love as God loves, and every time God loves, and you can go through the love of the Trinity, the love of creation, the love of God in the Incarnation, the love of God with the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ, the love of God through the Holy Spirit. Each and every one of those has the same five characteristics, and one of them is life, and one of them is permanence. And if you take any of those characteristics out, any five of those characteristics out, it's no longer love. And there's only two ways to relate to people and things. You're supposed to love people and use things. And so life is part of love. Permanence is part of love. A will act that's a self-gift is part of love. The knowledge of human dignity, which is the motive for love, is part of love. Take permanence out. Ladies, what do you do with a toaster that stops working? Throw it out. What do you do with a husband that stops working? That's the difference between love and use. You take life out. Is it using or loving? It's using. You don't have love and life. You have love, and you love as God loves. And that puts the synthesis of St. Alphonsus back together again. And it answers the exclusion question in a way that is really beyond brilliant. So I think I'm about to get the proverbial hook. Yeah. So thank you very much.
those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding